Marcus's fingers closed around Ashley's wrist like a steel trap. Not a gentle touch, not a guiding hand. A grip, the kind that leaves bruises shaped like a man's certainty that he owns you. "Smile," he said through his teeth, his voice dropping so low only she could hear it. "You are embarrassing me." Ashley smiled. She had become very good at smiling. The mayor's annual charity gala was in full bloom around them. 300 of the city's most powerful people draped in silk and self-importance, crystal chandeliers throwing golden light across a ballroom that cost more per night than most families earned in a year. A string quartet played in the corner. Champagne arrived in flutes so thin they looked like they might shatter from the sound of applause. Everything was perfect. Everything was suffocating. "I only asked to step outside for air, Marcus." Ashley kept her voice steady, controlled. She had learned that too. 5 minutes. "You'll get air when I say you get air." His grip tightened. She felt the diamond necklace at her throat catch the chandelier light-heavy, custom, blindingly beautiful. Marcus had clasped it around her neck himself that evening, adjusting it with 2 careful hands and a smile that hadn't reached his eyes. "Wear this tonight. Don't take it off." She hadn't thought to question it then. 300 people stood within eyeshot. None of them looked. That was the arrangement at events like this. Wealth had a way of making inconvenient things invisible. Then Marcus yanked her arm, hard, pulling her back toward him as she tried to step away. Her silver earring caught the light as her head snapped sideways. The champagne glass in her free hand tilted. And then, a hand closed around Marcus's wrist. Not a grab, not a lunge, just a quiet, absolute arrival like a door sealing shut on a vault. Tattooed fingers, dark ink crawling across skin, intricate and deliberate, the kind of artwork that didn't belong in a ballroom and knew it. The hand simply appeared, and it did not move. Neither did Marcus. For the first time all evening, Marcus Price, city councilman, future mayoral candidate, the man who owned 3 judges and a police commissioner, went completely, utterly still. Ashley turned. The man standing behind Marcus was immaculate. Black tuxedo, crisp white shirt, bow tie knotted with surgical precision, dark hair swept back from a face that was stone-carved and unreadable. He was not the largest man in the room. He didn't need to be. The tattoos on his neck crawled toward his jawline like a quiet threat. His eyes, when they moved from Marcus to Ashley, were completely calm. That was the terrifying part. "Let her go," Yang Quan said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words arrived the way a blade arrives. You don't hear it. You simply feel it. The string quartet hit a wrong note and stopped. One by one, conversations flickered out across the ballroom the way candles die in a draft. Heads turned. Phones appeared in hands. 300 people who had been professionally blind for the last 4 minutes were suddenly, desperately paying attention. Marcus let out a short breath. "You have 3 seconds to remove your hand before I have you removed from this building." "That's interesting," Quan said. He didn't remove his hand. "Because you don't own this building." Quan's gaze moved through the frozen ballroom, with the patience of a man who had never once needed to rush. "The Meridian Grand is held under a commercial property trust. That trust carries a lien. That lien belongs to a private financial group called Heiki Capital." He paused. "Which is mine." Marcus blinked. "Your campaign headquarters on 5th?" Quan continued, the same quiet, surgical tone. 12-year lease. The landlord refinanced 18 months ago through a subsidiary of Heiki Capital. Your re-election fundraiser next month is being catered by a hospitality company I acquired in February. The ballroom had gone so still that Ashley could hear her own heartbeat. "What I am saying, Councilman," Quan said softly, "is that a remarkable number of the rooms you walk into, I was already in them." Marcus's face had drained to the color of old ash. His grip on Ashley's wrist did not loosen. His hand had simply forgotten to let go. Quan looked down at it. Then he looked at Marcus. "I won't ask again." 300 people did not breathe. Marcus released her. Ashley's wrist throbbed where his fingers had been. She didn't reach for it. She didn't look at Marcus. She looked at the man in the black tuxedo with the tattooed hands and the immovable face, and she felt something shift in the room, in the air, in the entire architecture of the evening. Quan didn't look at Marcus again. He was already done with him. He looked at Ashley. Just once. Brief, assessing, unreadable. Then he offered her his arm, unhurried. as though they had planned this all along, and said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "Walk with me." And because 300 people were recording, and Marcus was standing there with his political future leaking out of him like champagne from a shattered flute, Ashley took his arm, and young Quan walked her out of the Grand Meridian Ballroom while the city's most powerful people watched and did not say a single word. The elevator doors closed behind them, and the noise of the ballroom vanished, sealed off like something that had happened in another life. Ashley stood beside young Quan in the mirrored elevator and watched the floor numbers climb. She didn't speak. He didn't speak. The only sound was the soft mechanical hum of the car ascending and the distant percussion of her own heartbeat, which had not slowed since his hand closed around Marcus's wrist. She studied herself in the mirror across from her, red dress, sculpted updo, still intact, silver earrings catching the elevator light the way they had caught the chandeliers. She looked composed. She looked like a woman who had simply stepped out for air. Her wrist told a different story. The bruise was already forming a ring of dark pressure, exactly the width of Marcus's thumb. She pressed her free hand over it and looked away from her reflection. "You don't have to cover it," Quan said. She hadn't realized he was watching her. In the mirror, his face was the same as it had been in the ballroom, unreadable, controlled, offering nothing, but his eyes had moved to her wrist. "I'm not covering it," she said. He didn't push it. That surprised her. Every man she had known for the past 3 years had a habit of pushing, of needing the last word, of filling silence with demands. Young Quan seemed perfectly comfortable with silence. He stood with both hands clasped in front of him, the dark ink of his tattoos disappearing into his cuffs, and he looked at nothing in particular until the elevator arrived at its destination with a soft, decisive chime. The doors opened into a private lobby. 2 men were already standing there, wide, quiet, dressed in dark suits that could pass for formal wear in the right light. Neither of them looked at Ashley with curiosity. They looked at her with the careful, professional blankness of people who were paid never to be surprised. "Mr. Yang." One of them gave a short nod. Quan walked past them without acknowledgement. Ashley followed, because the alternative was standing alone in the elevator, and whatever this was, it was safer than what she'd left downstairs. The penthouse was not what she'd expected. She had expected something that announced itself, the kind of space that performed its own wealth, floor-to-ceiling excess, gold fixtures, the visual language of a man who needed you to know. Instead, the apartment was spare and deliberate. Dark hardwood floors, furniture in charcoal and slate, chosen for weight rather than decoration. One entire wall was glass, and through it, the city sprawled in every direction, thousands of lights blinking against the dark like a circuit board running at full capacity. There were no paintings on the walls. There was one shelf of books, tightly packed, spines facing out with no particular arrangement. A half-empty glass of water sat on the kitchen island, as though someone had set it down mid-thought and simply not returned. It was the apartment of a man who was always about to leave. "Sit," Quan said, not unkindly. More the way someone speaks when they're accustomed to being obeyed and no longer think to dress it up. Ashley sat on the edge of the couch, straight-backed, her red dress pooling around her, the necklace cool against her collarbone. She watched him remove his jacket, fold it over the back of a chair, and move to the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had performed the same sequence 1,000 times. He returned with 2 glasses of water and set one in front of her. She didn't touch it. "You're going to want to ask me questions," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Several. Most of them I won't answer tonight." He picked up his own glass. "But ask." Ashley held his gaze. In the ballroom, surrounded by 300 witnesses and the architecture of a public standoff, it had been easier to be brave. Here, alone, with the city spread out behind him like a kingdom he'd already claimed, the full weight of what she'd walked into began pressing down on her chest. "Who are you?" she said. Not a question, exactly. More like the beginning of an accounting. "You know who I am. I know your name. I know what people say. Then you know enough for tonight." "What people say," Ashley continued, "is that you run the most profitable criminal syndicate on the Eastern Seaboard. That you have 17 legitimate businesses, and none of them are actually legitimate. That the last man who publicly crossed you retired to a hospital bed. She paused. Permanently. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement. Something quieter than that. And yet here you are, he said. Here I am, she agreed. In your apartment. At midnight. Because my other option was standing in that ballroom with Marcus, and I think we both know how that evening was going to end. Quan said nothing. He watched her the way he seemed to watch everything with a patience that had no visible bottom. You didn't do that for me, Ashley said. In the ballroom. You didn't step in because you felt sorry for me. A pause. No, he said. Then why? He looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped just briefly. Just long enough to be deliberate to the necklace at her throat. Ashley's hand moved to it instinctively. Get some sleep, Quan said, and stood. We'll talk in the morning. She didn't sleep. She lay in the guest room, clean, spare, a window with a city view and a door that was not locked, which somehow made it feel more like a cage than if it had been, and she stared at the ceiling and ran inventory on the last 4 hours of her life. Marcus's grip. The bruise forming under silk. The way 300 people had looked at their phones instead of her eyes. The hand closing around Marcus's wrist like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Let her go. She reached up in the dark and touched the necklace. Marcus had clasped it himself, both hands, careful, adjusting the weight of it at the back of her neck. He'd never done that before. Marcus didn't dress her, didn't fuss. He handed her things and expected them to be worn correctly. Wear this tonight. Don't take it off. She sat up. Quan was already awake when she found him at the kitchen island. A laptop open, a coffee cup beside it. The jacket was gone. The bow tie was gone. His shirt was open at the collar, and the tattoos that had crawled up his neck at the gala continued further than she'd realized across his collarbone, disappearing under the white fabric in both directions, intricate and dark, and covering more of him than the tuxedo had suggested. He looked up when she walked in, registered the fact that she was still in her gown. She'd found a robe draped over the guest chair but hadn't touched it, and then looked back at his screen without comment. The necklace, Ashley said. He closed the laptop. Sit down, Ashley. It was the first time he'd used her name. She sat. Quan stood and moved around the island, and for a moment she thought he was going to reach for the necklace himself, but he stopped, keeping a careful distance, and looked at it instead. Marcus Price has been stealing from my organization for 14 months, he said. Not money. Data. Financial records, the full ledger of Heike Capital's private transactions. Names. Accounts. Wire transfers. Shell companies. Everything. He paused. 6 weeks ago, my people traced the ledger to a microchip, 12 millimeters, embedded in a custom setting. His gaze met hers, inside the largest stone in that necklace. The room felt very still. Ashley looked down. The diamond caught the kitchen light and threw it in every direction, white and brilliant and utterly ordinary looking. She had worn it to 3 events since Marcus had given it to her. She had slept in it once, because she'd come home too exhausted to unclasp it. He had given it to her 5 weeks before the gala, a gift, he'd said, for the mayor's anniversary dinner, presented in a velvet box with the kind of ceremony he usually reserved for press appearances. She had been carrying his stolen evidence against a Korean crime syndicate around her neck for 6 weeks. He used you as a courier, Quan said, because no one searches the mayor's favorite couple, because you go where he goes, and your bag doesn't get checked, and your jewelry doesn't get flagged. He let that land before continuing. I was at the gala tonight to retrieve it. That was the only reason. Ashley absorbed this. She was good at absorbing things, years of practice. Absorbing Marcus's moods, his reversals, his explanations for why things were always her fault. She had developed a very efficient system for taking in information that should break her and simply filing it somewhere she could examine later. So when you intervened, she said carefully, it was because I needed you out of that room before Marcus realized what I was there for. Not because he was hurting me. Quan held her gaze. Both things can be true. It wasn't a deflection, exactly. It wasn't a confession, either. It sat somewhere in the precise middle, and she didn't have enough information yet to know what to do with it. She reached up and unclasped the necklace herself. She set it on the kitchen island between them. The diamond caught the light one more time, and then just sat there, a beautiful, dangerous, ordinary-looking thing. "Take it," she said, "and then have someone drive me home." Quan looked at the necklace. He didn't touch it. "I can't do that," he said. "I'm not asking for your permission. Marcus knows you left with me." His voice was even flat, like a weather report. "By now, he knows I'm the one who has the necklace, and he knows you know it." He paused. "He cannot afford to let you walk back through your front door with that knowledge, Ashley. Neither version of Marcus, the politician or the other one, can survive what you now know." She stared at him. "So what you're telling me," she said slowly, "is that I'm not here for my own protection. You're here because the alternative is worse." "That is not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The honesty of it, blunt, undecorated, offered without apology, knocked something loose in her chest. Every conversation she'd had with Marcus for 3 years had been layered, managed. Even his cruelty came dressed up as something else. Young Quan was, apparently, simply going to tell her the truth and let her decide what to do with it. She looked at the necklace. She looked at him. "You said the ledger is inside the chip," she said. "Yes." "Is it encrypted?" A pause. "Yes. How long have you been trying to crack it?" His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. 11 days. Ashley nodded slowly. She reached out and picked the necklace back up, turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of the stone, examining the setting the way she might examine a balance sheet, looking for the seam, the anomaly, the place where the numbers didn't quite add up. "I'll keep it," she said. "For now." She stood up. "You should know," she said, moving toward the hallway, "that I went to Northwestern on an accounting scholarship. I spent 4 years at a forensic financial firm before Marcus decided my career was inconvenient." She glanced back over her shoulder. "So when you say the ledger is encrypted, and you've had 11 days, and you still can't open it, that's actually useful information." She left him standing in the kitchen with his coffee going cold and his laptop closed, and, for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time, no obvious next move. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. Ashley was sitting at the kitchen island when Kwan's phone lit up on the counter. He answered it in Korean, quick, quiet, his face doing nothing, and then ended the call and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to identify, as there is bad news, and I am deciding how much of it to give you. 3 police units, he said. Your apartment, 40 minutes ago. Ashley set down her coffee cup very carefully. They had a warrant, Kwan continued. Drug possession. Someone called in a tip last night. He watched her face. Marcus has a relationship with the deputy commissioner. She knew. She'd known for 2 years. She'd filed it away in the same place she filed everything she wasn't allowed to say out loud. My things, she said. My people got there first. What was essential has been moved. The rest, he left it there. The rest was gone. She understood that. The apartment she'd spent 18 months making look like a home. The books she'd bought herself. The one decent photograph she had of her mother. The small green plant on the windowsill that had somehow survived her, all of it, now, was a crime scene Marcus had manufactured overnight. She sat very still for a moment. Then something happened in her chest, something quiet and conclusive, like a door closing from the inside. Not grief, something past grief, something that was finished with being surprised. He moved fast, she said. Yes, which means he's scared. Yes. Good. She stood up. Then we need to move faster. They set her up in a room on the 4th floor of the penthouse's private wing. It turned out the apartment extended across 2 floors, which she hadn't realized in the dark. And it had a desk, and 2.5 monitors, and a secure network that Kwan's people had apparently assembled before she'd even finished her second cup of coffee. The chip from the necklace had been extracted overnight by a man who arrived, did his work in 11 minutes, and left without making eye contact with anyone. The data was now loaded onto a secure drive, projected across both screens in a dense cascade of numbers and account strings, and transaction codes that had apparently defeated Kwan's financial team for nearly 2 weeks. Ashley sat in front of it and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Herself. It's a 4-layer encryption, said the man who'd been assigned to brief her mid-30s, sharp-faced. introduced only as Shin. He stood to her left with his arms crossed, and he had the energy of someone who deeply resented being asked to explain his failures to a stranger in an evening gown. The outer layer we cracked in 6 hours. The second layer took 4 days. The third— "You're hitting a recursive loop," Ashley said. Shin stopped. She was already leaning forward, scrolling through the data with one hand, pulling up the third layer structure on the second screen. He built a false floor into it. Every time you try to break the third layer, it reads your decryption attempt as a key input and uses it to re-encrypt the fourth, so the harder you push, the tighter it locks. She sat back. Marcus didn't build this. He's smart, but he's not this kind of smart. He paid for it. She could feel Shin looking at her. She didn't look back. "Where did you train?" he asked after a moment. "Northwestern. Then 6 years in private forensic accounting. Mostly corporate fraud cases." She pulled up a side panel and started mapping the encryption architecture. "Marcus made me leave the firm in year 2 of our relationship. Said it was a conflict of interest with his political work." A pause. He was right, just not in the way he meant. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. Kwon came in once, stood in the doorway, looked at the screens, looked at her, and left. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hover. He simply registered what was happening and withdrew, which she appreciated more than she had words for. By mid-afternoon, she disassembled the third layer. By evening, she had a clear view of the fourth. She pushed back from the desk and went to find Kwon. He was in the main room, standing at the glass wall with a phone to his ear. He ended the call when she came in. "I can open it," she said. "The full ledger, all 4 layers. Probably 2 days. Maybe 3. He looked at her steadily. "But I need something from you first." "Name it." Ashley held his gaze. She had spent 3 years with a man who made promises the way other people made small talk automatically, without intention, designed only to move the conversation to more comfortable ground. She had learned to read the space between what men said and what they meant. Young Kwon, she was beginning to understand, did not make small talk. "I need your word," she said. "Not a contract, not a legal arrangement, your word, personally. That when this is over, when Marcus is finished and whatever you need from that ledger is handled, I don't disappear. I don't become a liability you need to manage." She kept her voice level. "I want a life, a real one. Somewhere he can't reach, with my name clean and enough distance to start over. I want your protection, permanently, not as a hostage, but as an agreement between equals." The room was very quiet. Kwon looked at her for a long moment. The city burned behind him through the glass. "Agreed," he said. "One word, unadorned." And she believed it. "Then I'll have the 4th layer open by Thursday." What she didn't say, because she didn't know it yet, was that opening the 4th layer would not be the end of it. She turned to go back to work. "Ashley." She stopped. "The necklace," he said. "I'm sorry he put it on you." She didn't turn around. She stood still for a moment, absorbing it the strange, spare weight of an apology from a man she suspected rarely offered them. "So am I," she said, and went back to the desk. Thursday came and went. So did Friday. Not because she couldn't crack it, she'd had the structure mapped by Thursday morning, exactly as promised. But the ledger, once it began opening, kept revealing new rooms. Marcus hadn't just stolen Kwon's financial records. He'd layered his own documentation inside 14 months of his own transactions, his political contributions, his offshore routing, the names of every official he'd bought, and every deal he'd laundered through his campaign finances. It was, Ashley realized on Friday evening, the single most comprehensive record of high-level political corruption she had ever seen. She stopped working and stared at the screen. Kwon came in at some point she'd stopped tracking time precisely, sleeping in 2- and 3-hour intervals, and returning to the desk with coffee that had usually gone cold and stopped when he saw her face. "What is it?" "He documented everything himself," she said. "Marcus. He kept records of all of it, the bribes, the accounts, the favors. Meticulous records." She turned to look at Kwon. He was building leverage. On everyone. Collecting evidence of every dirty transaction so that if anyone ever came for him, he could take half the city's political establishment down with him. Kwon moved closer and looked at the screen. Mutually assured destruction, he said. Exactly. Ashley turned back to it. Which means what we have isn't just your ledger. It's a complete map of his entire operation. Every account, every name, every offshore routing number. She paused. If someone who knew what they were looking at were to spend, say, 48 hours working through these accounts systematically, you could drain them, Quan said. I could make them disappear, Ashley corrected. Drain implies the money goes somewhere traceable. I mean, I could restructure the routing so completely that by the time anyone realized what had happened, the accounts would simply no longer exist in any jurisdiction that would cooperate with his lawyers. She heard Quan exhale slow, controlled, but something was different in it. Something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. You've done this before, he said. I've reversed it before, she said. Forensic accounting. You work fraud cases long enough. You understand the architecture from both sides. She looked up at him. I used to help prosecutors find the money. Same skill set, different direction. He was standing close enough that she could see the exact place where the tattoo at his neck disappeared into his collar. A coiled line of ink that suggested something larger beneath the fabric, patient and contained, the same way he was. His dark eyes moved across the screens, with the focus of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. This changes things, he said. It changes everything, she agreed. There was a silence between them, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones they'd shared before. Those had been careful, measured. The silence of two people who didn't know each other and were deciding how much to risk. This one had weight to it. Shared weight, the kind that accumulates when two people have been in the same room long enough, working toward the same thing, that the boundary between your problem and our problem starts to blur at the edges. Ashley became aware, for the first time, of how close he was standing. She looked back at the screen. You should sleep, Quan said. I'm not tired. You're exhausted. There's a difference. She turned to argue, and found him much closer than she'd calculated. Not threatening, nothing about Quan ever felt threatening to her anymore, which was itself a strange thing to notice, but close enough that she could see the careful control in his expression, the thing he kept very tightly managed, the thing that occasionally surfaced in his eyes when he looked at her for a half-second longer than was strictly necessary before pulling his gaze away. She'd noticed. She'd been noticing for 2 days. I want to finish this section tonight, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. It'll be here in the morning. So will Marcus's people. My people are handling Marcus's people. He reached past her, and with 2 keystrokes, saved her progress and dimmed both screens. His arm was close enough to her shoulder that she felt the warmth of it. He stepped back immediately, deliberately. 4 hours. Then come back. She stood. She was close enough to him that she had to angle her chin up slightly to hold his gaze, and something in the architecture of that, looking up at a man and feeling something other than the familiar alertness of self-protection, was so disorienting that it took her a moment to locate her voice. You said you were only at the gala for the necklace, she said. Yes. Was that completely true? Something moved in his expression, subtle, barely there, but it moved. Get some sleep, Ashley, he said. She went. She lay in the dark of the guest room, her room, now, in the way that a place becomes yours when you've had nowhere else to go for long enough, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about the particular quality of his voice when he said her name, the economy of it, how he gave nothing away and somehow, in the withholding, gave everything. She thought about Marcus and how his voice had always been loudest, precisely when he had the least to say. She thought about what it meant that the only man who had told her the truth in 3 years was a man who ran a criminal empire and had tattoos climbing his neck and a file of personal information about everyone in the city that he maintained the way other men maintained their calendars. She thought about the ledger and the accounts and the 48 hours of work that was going to unravel everything Marcus had built. She thought about what it would feel like to be the woman who took him apart, not rescued, not extracted, not handed a safe house and a new identity and a quiet life in a city where no one knew her name, the woman who sat down at a computer and made him disappear. She fell asleep with that thought, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't dream about running. They moved her on a Saturday. Quan had decided the penthouse was too visible, too many eyes on the building's entrance, too many variables he couldn't control from the inside. The safe house was a converted townhouse 40 minutes north of the city, unremarkable from the street, the kind of building that registers as background and nothing more. Ashley packed the things that were hers, now a week's worth of clothes his people had sourced, her laptop, a printed copy of the ledger's architecture she'd been annotating by hand, and sat in the back of the second car in a 3-vehicle convoy while the city scrolled past the tinted windows. She had been watching the city differently since the gala. She noticed things she used to move through without seeing the angles between buildings, the distance between streetlights, the way a parked car on a corner could mean nothing or could mean everything, depending on who was sitting in it. Living inside Quan's world for 10 days had recalibrated her eyes. Quan was in the first car. That was the arrangement she'd been told, without being asked, that she would travel in the middle vehicle. She'd accepted it without arguing because she'd spent enough time around his people now to understand that the logistics weren't suggestions, and also because some quiet, rational part of her had accepted that young Quan knowing how to move her safely through a city was, at this particular moment in her life, a useful quality in a person. They were 4 blocks from the highway when the black SUV ran the red light. It happened fast, the way violence always does, the way it always catches you mid-thought, mid-breath, mid the ordinary moment just before. The SUV came from the left, accelerating through the intersection, and hit the lead car at the rear quarter panel with a sound like a building falling. The convoy lurched. Her driver was already moving hand on the gear shift, eyes up, reading it 2 seconds ahead, but the second SUV was already blocking them from behind. And then the doors were opening, and the men coming out of them were not police. "Stay down," her driver said it once, flat, and she was already doing it down behind the seat, the annotated ledger pressed against her chest for no rational reason. Her heart beat loud in her ears. The gunfire was shockingly loud in an open street. She heard Quan's voice, a single sharp command in Korean, carrying over everything else, and then the sound of return, fire, and then movement, and then his door opening. She felt the car shift as someone new got in. "We're moving," Quan said. He was in the seat beside her driver, a different door than she'd expected. She started to sit up. "Stay down, Ashley." "Are you—" "Stay down." The car accelerated hard, jumping a curb, cutting through the cross street while she braced against the door and tried to breathe. She could hear the third car behind them. She could hear, more distantly, sirens beginning, real ones, city ones, the kind Marcus would have already called in through the right number. It took 11 minutes to lose the pursuit. She counted them. When the car finally slowed to something resembling a normal speed, she sat up. Quan was in the front seat. His right hand was resting against his side, just below the ribs, in the careful way of someone managing a location rather than touching it. His jacket was dark enough that she almost missed it. Almost. "You're hit," she said. "It's managed." That is not an answer. She was already moving, climbing between the seats, which was absurd, and not the most absurd thing happening, and he turned to look at her with an expression that was equal parts warning and resignation, the expression of a man who had just calculated that arguing would cost more energy than allowing it. She got a hand against his side and felt the warmth of it through his shirt. He didn't flinch. His jaw tightened fractionally, controlled, and that single small tell of pain did something to her chest that she didn't have space to examine right now. "Through and through," he said. "It exited. No organ involvement. You know this how? Because I've been shot before." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the same steady patience he brought to everything, the same quality of a man who has made his peace with a large number of difficult circumstances and simply keeps moving through them. "I'll need a kit," she told the driver. "Already called ahead," the driver said. She kept her hand where it was for the rest of the drive, applying pressure, and Quan said nothing about it. He looked out the windshield at the city moving past, and occasionally spoke into his phone in Korean and did not tell her to move, or that he was fine, or any of the things men usually said when they were not fine. She thought about the way he'd been in the lead car, the way he'd moved into hers. She thought about the specific sequence of priorities that required the calculation a person runs, even in the middle of a firefight, about what matters most, about where they need to physically be. She didn't say anything about it. She kept her hand against his side and applied pressure and looked out the window, and the city blurred past, and something that had been approaching for 10 days arrived quietly and settled in her chest and stayed there. He was stitched up and furious by midnight, not visibly furious. Quan didn't do visible, but she'd developed sufficient literacy in his particular silences to read the one that meant my organization was just attacked on a public street. And I am conducting a detailed internal review of every variable that allowed this to happen. She left him to it. She went to the desk they'd set up in the townhouse's back room, smaller than the penthouse setup. 2 monitors instead of 2.5. A window overlooking a garden that had stopped being tended sometime last year, and she sat down and opened the ledger and worked. She worked because it was what she could do. She worked because the ambush had made the timeline suddenly, viscerally real. Marcus was not going to wait. He was not going to negotiate or retreat or blink. He was going to keep escalating until something stopped him or something ended, and the only thing she had that could actually stop him was sitting in front of her on 2 screens, waiting to be used. She worked through the night. At some point, Quan appeared in the doorway with his arm wrapped and his collar open, and a second cup of coffee that he set down beside hers without comment, before returning to whatever he was managing. The gesture was so quiet and so ordinary that she almost missed it. She didn't miss it. By 4 in the morning, she had the 4th layer completely mapped. By 6, she had the first of Marcus's offshore accounts open in front of her. She sat back and looked at it, the architecture of his corruption, laid out in clean columns, every transaction a small monument to the confidence of a man who had never believed anyone was looking. She was looking now. "Quan," she called. He came in immediately, which told her he hadn't slept. She turned the second monitor to face him and let him read it. She watched his face while he did the careful, controlled scan of a man absorbing information, cataloging it, running its implications forward. Something moved behind his eyes. Not satisfaction, exactly. Something colder than satisfaction. 14 months, he said. 14 months of transactions. 47 shell companies across 9 jurisdictions. 3 offshore banks and 1 domestic routing structure he's been using through a legitimate real estate LLC. Ashley turned back to her screen. The domestic one is the easiest. It's also the one tied to his campaign finances, which means the moment it moves, it becomes a federal matter whether he wants it to or not. She pulled up the routing structure. I can begin the restructuring on the offshore accounts today. 48 hours of sustained work and there won't be a single reachable dollar left in any account connected to Marcus Price's name or any of his entities. Quan was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he said. "Uninterrupted time. Access to a secure transfer relay your people use, I know you have one. And coffee." She looked at him. "And for you to sleep, because you took a bullet 14 hours ago, and you look like you're running on principle alone." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile, but was in that neighborhood. "The relay I can arrange," he said. "The sleep is less certain." "Quan." He looked at her. "Sleep," she said. "I have this." He held her gaze for a moment. The particular quality of attention he gave things he was deciding whether to trust. The careful internal accounting she'd watched him run on every variable that entered his life. Then he nodded once and left the room. She turned back to the screens and began to dismantle Marcus Price's empire 1 account at a time. It took 61 hours. She slept in 4-hour intervals, came back to the desk, worked, slept again. Quan's people brought food she sometimes ate, and coffee she always drank. Quan himself came and went healing. She could see, moving more easily by the second day, the controlled stiffness at his side, gradually loosening, and each time he stopped in the doorway, he would look at the screens, look at her, and not ask questions she didn't have answers to yet. She appreciated that more than she could say. On the morning of the second day, Marcus's primary offshore account, the one holding $11.3 million in campaign money that had been rerouted through a Cayman entity and back through a Singaporean bank, simply ceased to exist. On the afternoon of the second day, the real estate LLC that had been his domestic routing structure was restructured. Its assets transferred through a relay chain that would take a team of forensic accountants no fewer than 8 months to fully untangle, into a holding pattern that would trigger an automatic federal reporting requirement the moment anyone tried to access it. On the morning of the third day, she opened the 31st account and found, sitting inside it alongside the financial records, a secondary cache of files she hadn't expected. Documents, communications, emails between Marcus and the deputy commissioner, emails between Marcus and a federal judge, photographs, recordings, digitized, dated, and meticulously labeled in the same handwriting, the same obsessive, self-incriminating documentation she'd found threaded through the ledger itself. Marcus had kept everything. Every piece of leverage he'd collected, every dirty arrangement he'd made, every person he owned, archived and encrypted, and stored inside the account he thought was furthest from anyone who could use it. She thought about that for a moment. Then she created a copy of everything, packaged it into a single encrypted file, and sent it to the secure address Quan had given her at the beginning of this. She leaned back in her chair. Outside the garden window, the light was doing the thing it does in very early morning gray at the edges, the world not yet committed to being day. She was exhausted in the way that goes past tiredness and becomes simply a state of being, a constant low hum of depletion that she'd stopped trying to fix and started just carrying. She was also, she realized, the most capable she had felt in 3 years. She picked up her coffee and held it with both hands and looked at the window and thought, "This is what you are. This is what you've always been. He just needed you not to know it." She was still sitting like that when Quan came in. He stopped when he saw her face. He'd gotten good at reading her, or perhaps he'd always been good at reading people and she was just becoming one worth reading. He didn't ask what had happened. He came and stood beside the desk and looked at the screens and waited. "It's done," she said. "All 47 accounts. He has nothing liquid left in any jurisdiction that won't immediately flag as evidence." She looked up at him. "And I found his personal archive. Everything he ever collected on everyone. I've packaged it for you." Quan looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You should rest," he said. "I know." She didn't move yet. "I want to know what happens next. To him. We begin making calls tonight. By morning, the right people will have the right files in front of them. The kind of people Marcus can't buy because he already burned them." Quan paused. "It will be federal. It will be thorough. And it will be public." She nodded. That was what she needed. Not revenge exactly, something more architectural than that. Something that couldn't be undone, couldn't be paid off, couldn't be made invisible by the right phone call to the right deputy commissioner. Something permanent. "Good," she said, and finally stood up. She was closer to him than she'd intended. The chair, the desk, the angle of standing in a small room had arranged them that way. He didn't step back. She didn't either. They stood in the gray early morning light, with 61 hours of work cooling on the screens behind her, and something that had been patient for 11 days, running out of reasons to wait. "Thank you," he said. Quiet, certain. The same way he said everything. "We're even," she said. "You got me out of that ballroom. I got you your ledger. That's not what I'm thanking you for." She looked at him. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She had understood for days. In the way you understand things, you're not ready to say out loud that what she'd given him wasn't just the ledger. It was the quality of how she'd shown up for it. The steadiness. The refusal to collapse or perform or negotiate from fear. She turned to leave, to finally go and sleep in the proper dark, and his hand closed gently around her wrist. Not like Marcus. Nothing like Marcus. Light, certain, asking rather than taking. She stopped. She turned back. And for a moment, they simply stood there, in a room full of evidence of a war they had nearly won, in a borrowed house in a city that was about to change, in the gray morning that was finally committing to being day, and the distance between them became a decision they were both making without words. She closed it. He met her there. And whatever had been building in the careful silences and the coffee cups and the doorway pauses and the hand pressed against a bullet wound on a city street, it arrived, finally, and it was nothing like she'd expected, and exactly what it had always been heading toward. She was asleep when they took her. It was Shin. She would find out later, after everything, after the glass tower and the water pitcher and the federal charges, that it had been Shin, the sharp-faced man who had resented explaining his failures to a stranger, who had decided his resentment was worth selling. That was the part she would turn over for a long time afterward, not the fear of it, not the hands dragging her from the bed, Not the dark vehicle and the drive she couldn't track because they'd put something over her head. The part that stayed was how deeply she had been sleeping. How, for the first time in 3 years, she had gone under completely no edges, no alertness, no part of her brain keeping watch. She had trusted the walls of the house, and the men outside the doors, and the particular gravity of the room she'd been in an hour before, and she had let herself sleep like someone who felt safe. She would not make that mistake again. Marcus's men were efficient. She could give them that. They moved her from room to vehicle in under 90 seconds, and they were professional enough not to hurt her more than they needed to a hand over her mouth, an arm across her shoulders, the practiced choreography of men who did this for a living. She fought anyway. She got a hand free and scratched, deep enough to draw blood on the arm nearest her before something pressed against her neck and the world turned to static, and then to nothing. She woke up in a chair. The room was glass and steel and too much space, the top floor of a building, floor-to-ceiling windows. The city spread 30-something floors below in the full brightness of a morning she'd lost track of. She recognized the architecture before she recognized the room. She'd seen the building in Marcus's campaign materials for 3 years. His headquarters, his fortress, the place from which he ran everything, the legitimate operation on the lower floors, and, she now knew, everything else above it. Marcus was standing at the window. He still looked like a councilman. That was the thing about Marcus even now, with his financial empire in ruins and his political future accelerating toward the earth at terminal velocity. He was wearing a perfectly pressed charcoal suit and standing with the posture of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He turned when she shifted in the chair. "Ashley," he said. Warm, familiar, the voice he used at campaign dinners. "You look tired." She said nothing. "I need the decryption codes," Marcus said. He moved away from the window, rolling his cuffs with the patient deliberateness of someone demonstrating that they have all the time in the world. "Whatever key you use to access the 4th layer, I need to reverse what you've done, restore the accounts." He looked at her directly. "And then I need you to help me understand how much of my archive you've accessed, and exactly where those files have gone." "They're gone, Marcus. Everything can be recovered. Not the way I moved them." She held his gaze. The fear was there, she wasn't pretending it wasn't. She'd passed through the stage of pretending somewhere in the car on the way here, but it was underneath something else now. Something that didn't move. "You have nothing. The accounts are restructured beyond recovery in any workable timeline. The archive is in the hands of people you cannot buy, and you brought me here, which means you've just handed Yang Quan the one thing he needed to walk through your front door." Marcus's expression shifted. The warmth dropped out of it like a curtain falling. "You think he's coming for you," he said. "I think he's already on his way. He'll come for the ledger. That's all you are to him, a useful body he extracted from an inconvenient situation." She looked at Marcus. She thought about the coffee cups and the doorways and the hand around her wrist in the gray morning, asking rather than taking. "You'd know a lot about that," she said. His face went tight. He reached inside his jacket. The gun was a Sig Sauer. She registered the profile of it absently. The way you register details when your mind has decided to be very calm and very precise, when panic has stepped aside in favor of clarity. He held it with the ease of someone who had threatened people before and understood the grammar of it. "The codes," he said. "No. Ashley. No." He moved toward her, and the door behind him opened. The sound of it reached the floor, before the sound of Quan's men did a low concussion rolling up through the building from somewhere far below, the percussion of a door being removed from its frame by people who had not asked permission. Then the fire alarm. Then shouting, muffled by floors and walls and distance, getting less muffled by the second. Marcus's head snapped toward the door. 2 of his men were already moving, talking into earpieces, hands going to holsters, the whole mechanical response of a security operation discovering that its perimeter has been, politely speaking, resolved. Marcus turned back to Ashley with the gun still raised. And she moved. Not the way she'd planned it. Not the way you plan things in the abstract, the fantasy of what you'd do if you were brave enough. She simply moved out of the chair and sideways and toward him in the half-second his eyes were off her, and she got both hands around his gun wrist the way she'd seen Quan's men practice in the downstairs room of the townhouse on the afternoons she wasn't sleeping. She twisted, hard, toward his thumb, the way the weak point always is. Marcus was larger than her, and stronger than her, and full of the particular conviction of a man who had never seriously expected to be physically refused by a woman he'd spent 3 years conditioning not to fight back. That conviction cost him the gun. It clattered to the floor between them, and she kicked it sideways, hard, away from both of them, and then she stepped back and put 2 chairs between herself and Marcus, and picked up the closest thing to hand, which was a heavy glass water pitcher from the conference table, and held it like she intended to use it. Marcus stared at her. She stared back. "You've changed," he said. His voice had a new quality, not fear, not yet. Something before fear, the moment of recalibration. "I know," she said. The doors came off their hinges. Quan came through them the way he came through every room, without announcing himself, without the excess motion of a man who needed to perform his own arrival. He was in black, not a tuxedo this time, and the tattoos on his neck and hands were visible in a way that the formal wear had only hinted at, and he had 3 men behind him and an expression that was very still in the particular way of something that has just been containing a great deal of pressure for a very long time. He looked at Ashley first, 1 full second scanning, assessing, cataloging. She watched him find the answer he needed and watched something in him settle. Then he looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the gun on the floor, looked at Quan's men filling the doorway, looked at Ashley, who was still holding the water pitcher with no intention of putting it down. He looked, in that moment, like exactly what he was, a man whose architecture had been disassembled around him, standing in the wreckage of everything he'd built, holding nothing. "It's over, Marcus," Ashley said. She wasn't speaking to wound him. She was speaking because it was simply, factually, true, and Marcus had spent 3 years in a world where the truth was flexible and manageable, and she needed him to understand that this particular truth was not. He knew. She could see it in his face, the specific quality of a man who has run every remaining calculation and found that none of them come out in his favor. Quan crossed the room. He didn't touch Marcus. He stood in front of him, unhurried, unhostile, the absolute zero of a man who has already won and knows it, and he looked at him the way he'd looked at him in the ballroom, the same assessment, the same unblinking patience. "You made a significant error," Quan said, "when you put that necklace around her neck." Marcus had no answer for that. "My men will take you downstairs," Quan continued. "The federal agents will meet you there. You've met 2 of them before they were on your payroll. They aren't anymore." It was the most words she'd ever heard Quan say consecutively that weren't about logistics or the ledger, and he delivered them with the same quiet register he used for everything. No theater, no performance, just the facts of a situation, arranged in their proper order. Marcus looked at Ashley 1 more time. She met his eyes without flinching. Whatever he was looking for, remorse, fear, the woman who used to smile on command, he didn't find it. Quan's men took him out of the room. The silence afterward had a different quality than any silence she'd been in before. Lighter. Something had been removed from it. Quan came to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at the water pitcher she was still holding, and then looked at her face, and something happened in his expression, something private, something that wasn't for the room. "The gun," he said. "I kicked it away. I saw." A pause. "Are you hurt?" "No." She set the pitcher down. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were entirely steady. "You took your time. Traffic," he said. She looked at him. She thought she might laugh. The absurdity of it, of standing in Marcus's glass tower above a city that was about to receive a very significant quantity of federal documentation, holding a water pitcher, talking about traffic with a man who had just brought an organized assault through a 30-floor building to a room that smelled like expensive carpeting and collapse. She didn't laugh. She did something quieter than that, something that released 3 years of held breath in a single long exhale. Quan's hand came up and rested against her jaw. Light. Asking. She leaned into it. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. Marcus's arraignment was public and fast and covered by every outlet in the city, which was appropriate given that several of those outlets had previously accepted advertising money from his campaign. The charges were federal campaign finance fraud, money laundering, bribery of public officials, obstruction. The deputy commissioner was arrested the same morning. The federal judge followed 2 days later. The evidence package was described, by the prosecutor who presented it to the grand jury, as the most comprehensively documented case of political corruption she had encountered in 22 years of practice. She did not name the source. Ashley watched the arraignment on a laptop in the kitchen of the penthouse, both hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and felt very little of what she'd expected to feel. Not triumph, exactly. Not relief, though that was there, moving underneath everything else like a slow current. What she felt, mostly, was the particular stillness of something finished. A ledger balanced. The books finally closing on an account that had been running at a deficit for 3 years. Quan sat across from her and did not watch the arraignment. He watched her. "You could go," he said, when the coverage cut to a commercial. "We had an agreement. A life somewhere quiet. A clean name." He said it plainly. The way he said everything, offering it without loading it, without the hidden architecture of a man who needs you to choose what he wants you to choose. Ashley looked at him. She thought about the forensic accounting firm, the quiet life she'd had before Marcus, the small apartment, the case files, the satisfaction of following a number to its true source. She'd been good at that life. She'd been happy in it, in the modest, sustainable way of a person who knows what she is and is allowed to be it. She thought about what she was now. She thought about 61 hours at a screen, dismantling 47 accounts across 9 jurisdictions. About the gun on the floor, about the water pitcher, about the way it had felt not frightening, not borrowed, but hers, the most natural expression of something that had been building in her since the moment a tattooed hand had closed around Marcus's wrist in a ballroom full of people who were looking away. "The mole," she said. "The one inside your organization. The person who told Marcus where the safe house was." "Identified," Quan said. "Handled. It means there are gaps. In how you vet people. In how information moves inside your structure." She put the coffee cup down. A forensic accountant could map those gaps, could look at the financial flows inside an organization and find the places where something is being redirected, where a number doesn't match its stated origin, where loyalty has been purchased and is running as a liability on the books. Quan was very still. "You'd be describing a full-time position," he said carefully. "I'd be describing what I'm good at," she said, "and where I'm useful. And," she stopped, reorganized. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have the means to go anywhere now. I'm staying because this is the most honest room I've been in 3 years. Because you told me the truth when it would have been more convenient not to. Because the work is—" She paused again, looking for the right word. "Real. It's real work, with real consequences, and it matters which direction the numbers go." She looked at him across the kitchen island. "And because of you?" she said simply. Quan held her gaze for a long moment. In the window behind him, the city ran its lights across the morning sky, thousands of lives in motion, entirely unaware of what had shifted in the architecture above them. He had the particular expression she'd come to understand meant he was doing the accounting on something important, running the numbers on a proposition, checking it from every angle for the flaw he'd missed. She watched him not find one. "You understand what this life is," he said. It wasn't a warning. It was the last honest thing, the final piece of information laid on the table before a decision was made. "Better than I did 2 weeks ago," she said. "Yes," he said. "You do." He stood and moved around the island, not hurrying. Never hurrying. This man who had all the patience of something very old and very certain, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the way she'd felt in the ballroom when his eyes had moved from Marcus to her for that one assessing second. Except now she knew what the assessment looked like when it was finished, when it had run every variable and arrived at its answer. He offered her his hand. She took it. Outside, the city continued its business, the corruption newly excised from its body, the headlines still running, the gears of consequence turning in all the right directions. Inside, in a penthouse above it all, a woman who had walked into a ballroom in a red dress and walked out into a different kind of life, stood next to the most dangerous man in the city and felt, for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, entirely, completely free. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had simply, finally, been given the space to be precisely who she already was. And she had done the rest herself. Can Ashley and Quan outrun a man who built his entire empire on never letting go, and what is Marcus still hiding about the night he first put that necklace around her throat? Subscribe and turn on notifications, because you do not want to miss what is coming next. This story is only getting darker. Drop a comment. Do you think their love can survive when the city itself becomes the battlefield? Like this, if you are obsessed with this forbidden romance between a forensic accountant and a mafia boss that keeps raising the stakes. The next chapter drops soon, and trust me, you are not ready for what Ashley finds buried in the last file Marcus thought he destroyed. See you in the next one. If the Syndicate Queen and her king make it out alive,